Hi, I'm Imi. I'm the author of Mapping the Human Mind. Each chapter can be listened to on its own, but together they trace the story of how our beliefs have changed throughout history. Sometimes I'll step back to look at bigger themes, other times we'll zoom in on specific people or moments. Earlier chapters are available on my channel. This is Chapter 5, Greek Philosophy and Systematic Thought. When the world started asking, but why? The air is warm with sunlight, thick with the scent of olive groves and sea breeze. Marble columns rise towards the cloudless sky as sandals scrape against stone. Laughter and argument echo through a shaded portico. You are in ancient Athens. The gods still rule the temples, but something new is stirring in the minds of those gathered below. This is not a ritual, no incense burns, no hymns are sung. Instead, a question floats in the air, simple, disruptive, and electric. Why? For generations, stories had mapped the world. Thunder meant Zeus was angry. A failed harvest meant Demeter was grieving. The myths weren't superstition, they were frameworks of meaning, linking daily life to divine intervention. But now, a shift was beginning, quiet at first, then gathering momentum. One of the first to take the leap was Thales, a philosopher from Miletus, who proposed something extraordinary in its simplicity, that everything might arise from water, not because a priest had said so, but because he saw water in all things, in nourishment, in movement, in transformation. It wasn't a divine decree, it was a hypothesis. It sounds small, but it cracked open the door to something entirely new, the idea that nature could explain itself. This was a reorientation, a belief that truth could be discovered, not just inherited. Slowly, a new kind of consciousness began to form, one that prized observation, dialogue, and the daring act of asking questions without obvious answers. Thinkers like Pythagoras would follow, blending rational inquiry with mystical devotion. To him, numbers held divine power. Harmony was not just music, but a law of the universe. He founded a brotherhood as spiritual as it was mathematical, and they had rules. No beans, for one. Yes, beans, philosophy got weird. What was unfolding marked not just a change in answers, but a transformation in the way questions were asked. So why Greece, and why then? Maybe it was the crossroads of trade and culture, where Egyptian, Persian, and Babylonian knowledge mingled with local myth. Maybe it was the freedom to debate in the public squares of early democracy. Maybe it was the written word, suddenly able to preserve, revise, and spread new ways of thinking. Whatever the reason, something irreversible had begun. The world, once explained through stories alone, was beginning to reveal itself through patterns, reason, and inquiry. And with that shift, human thought would never be the same. Where reality gets philosophical. If you've ever sat through a class thinking, when are we ever going to use this in real life, you can thank or blame Plato, founder of the world's first academy. While the early philosophers had begun questioning the world, Plato took it further by creating an entire institution devoted to these questions. And his school wasn't concerned with algebra or state capitals, it wrestled with nothing less than the nature of reality itself. Above the entrance to Plato's academy stood the words, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Not because Plato particularly loved triangles, though he probably did, but because geometry represented perfect, unchanging truth. Unlike the messy physical world, a triangle's angles always add up to 180 degrees. This obsession with perfect eternal truths defined Plato's entire philosophy. His most famous idea, the theory of forms, essentially declares that everything we see represents mere cheap knockoffs of the real thing. According to Plato, what we perceive through our senses merely shadows perfect eternal forms that exist beyond the physical world. That chair you're sitting on? merely an imperfect copy of the ideal chairness that exists in the realm of forms. Plato's ideas didn't fit neatly into either science or religion. They hovered in a space between, where reason reached towards something transcendent. His allegory of the cave is more than a metaphor for ignorance. It's a vision of awakening. Prisoners mistake shadows on the cave walls for reality until one escapes and sees the world beyond. It's not just a philosophical argument, it's a myth of transformation, a symbolic journey from illusion to truth that would echo through spiritual traditions for centuries. Think about something you believe to be absolutely true. Now ask yourself, how do you know? Is it based on direct experience, or is it something you were taught? Could it, like the shadows in Plato's cave, be just a reflection of something deeper? And if this sounds reminiscent of mysticism dressed in philosophical language, you've spotted an important connection. Consider the revolutionary impact. Plato challenged everyday perception by proposing that behind the shifting world of appearances lay a perfect eternal reality. His highest ideal, the form of the good, became a philosophical North Star, abstract, transcendent, and deliberately undefined. Though not a deity in itself, Plato described it as beyond being, suggesting a reality more fundamental than existence itself. This opened the door to later theological interpretations, providing a conceptual bridge to emerging monotheistic ideas of a single eternal source. Plato's Academy became an educational model that endured for centuries, operating for over 900 years until Emperor Justinian shut it down in 529 CE. Plato created a space where questions could be examined through dialogue and systematic reasoning, radically departing from education based on memorization and tradition. Beyond simply teaching content, the Academy taught a method of thinking that would eventually reshape civilization. Categorizing reality one species at a time. If Plato was philosophy's dreamer, gazing towards perfect forms beyond our world, his star pupil Aristotle was its practical problem solver, rolling up his sleeves to catalogue and categorize everything within it. While his teacher looked up to heaven, he looked around at fish, birds, plants, politics, poetry, and pretty much everything else he could get his hands on. Picture the world's most ambitious librarian. That was Aristotle. Beyond philosophizing, he created entire fields of study: biology, ethics, logic, metaphysics, poetics, all either founded or fundamentally shaped by one supremely confident Greek with a passion for putting things in categories. He essentially pioneered scientific thinking, insisting that understanding requires careful and systematic observation. When Aristotle disagreed with Plato's theory of forms, he initiated a fundamental shift in how humans would approach knowledge. Rather than searching beyond physical objects for their perfect essence, Aristotle declared, "No, the essence is right here in the thing itself." Though seemingly subtle, this distinction marks a profound difference between studying animal biology by contemplating the perfect horseness versus actually dissecting a horse to see how it works. And dissect he did. Aristotle's zoological works describe the parts and movements of hundreds of animals with remarkable accuracy. He classified creatures, analysed their behaviour, and pioneered empirical research. Like a child who takes apart the toaster to understand its workings, Aristotle dismantled the entire natural world. As a systematic thinker, Aristotle created analytical tools we still use today. His development of formal logic, syllogisms, categories, and definitions established the framework through which Western civilization would process information for centuries. Every time you create a classification system, make a logical argument, or analyse a problem by breaking it into parts, you employ Aristotelian methods. His approach to ethics reflected the same methodical spirit. Where early philosophers spoke of virtue in broad strokes, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics reads like a field guide to goodness. Virtue, in his framework, emerges as the golden mean between extremes. Courage balances between recklessness and cowardice. Generosity finds the middle ground between wastefulness and stinginess. He offers a practical approach to morality, almost like a recipe book for human excellence. His philosophical system introduced the concept of the unmoved mover, a perfect, unchanging entity causing all motion while remaining motionless itself. Rather than representing the personal God of later monotheistic religions, it served as a philosophical principle explaining the ultimate cause of all movement and change in the universe. This concept would later form an important bridge between Greek philosophy and monotheistic theology. After founding his own school, the Lyceum, Aristotle's influence spread throughout the ancient world. When Alexander the Great, his most famous student, conquered vast territories, he carried Greek philosophical ideas with him. Libraries and learning centres from Alexandria to Babylon began collecting and translating Greek works, ensuring Aristotelian thought would survive even as the political world changed around it. His influence wasn't confined to scrolls or classrooms, it became the architecture of how the West would come to think. And even today, when you instinctively classify a plant by its features or organise ideas into tidy categories, you're echoing a mind trained in Aristotelian logic. This habit of sorting the outer world became foundational, but it didn't stop there. The Greek mind looks inward. Having mastered the art of ordering nature, Greek thinkers turned that same analytical lens inward. What is the self? What makes us conscious? How do we know what we know? These questions move beyond abstract puzzles to explore the very nature of being human. The pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus famously declared, "I have searched for myself," suggesting that self-knowledge represented the most challenging and essential form of inquiry. Unlike the ritualistic self-transformation of earlier spiritual traditions, Greek thinkers approached consciousness as a subject for study, analysis, and rational understanding. Socrates, known primarily through Plato's dialogues, since he wrote nothing himself, centered philosophy on human consciousness with his famous dictum, "Know thyself." Far more than inspirational wall art, this phrase embodied a methodical approach to understanding the mind. Through his distinctive question and answer method, Socrates revealed that most people's beliefs lacked careful examination. The Socratic method served as a tool for turning consciousness back on itself, compelling the mind to examine its own assumptions. Plato expanded this inquiry by dividing the soul, psyche, into three parts: reason, spirit, or will, and appetite. Beyond theoretical psychology, this model explained internal conflicts. When you know a second slice of cake is a bad idea, reason weighs the consequences. Appetite craves the sweetness, and spirit, the part tied to willpower, decides which voice to listen to. In that moment, the internal balance or imbalance of the soul reveals itself. Plato's Republic explores more than politics. It examines the alignment of these aspects of the soul, proposing that a well-ordered mind mirrors a well-ordered society. Aristotle, with his biological perspective, took a more naturalistic approach. For him, the psyche functioned as the body's organising principle, the essential force making a living thing alive and functional. Plants possess nutritive souls enabling growth, animals added sensitive souls allowing perception, and humans alone had rational souls, permitting thought. In his view, consciousness represented a natural hierarchy of capabilities rather than something mystical. The Stoics later developed remarkably modern theories about perception. They believed that impressions, what they called phantasiae, strike our senses constantly, but we're not at their mercy. we still have the power to choose whether to accept these impressions or push them aside. This wasn't theory for theory's sake, it was practical psychology, centuries ahead of its time. By realizing that it's not events themselves but our judgments about them that create suffering, the Stoics laid the groundwork for emotional self-regulation techniques still used today. Have you ever caught yourself acting on impulse and wondered, why did I do that? Do your emotions, instincts and rational thoughts always align, or do they sometimes feel at war with each other? If so, congratulations, you've engaged in a philosophical inquiry about consciousness with roots in ancient Greece. These Greek insights transformed human self-understanding. For the first time, the mind became both subject and object, able to turn inward and examine its own workings. This reflexive awareness opened new frontiers for self-knowledge, laying the groundwork for everything from religious introspection to modern psychology. When Augustine wrote his Confessions, he explored his consciousness with unprecedented depth, building on methods of self-analysis rooted in ancient Athens. Centuries later, when Freud mapped the unconscious mind, he was continuing a project the Greeks had begun, using the mind to understand itself. Greek theories of consciousness raised enduring questions about the relationship between perception and reality. If our minds actively shape what we perceive, how can we know what truly exists out there? This problem, later termed epistemology, would become central to philosophy, science, and religion for millennia. In essence, Greek philosophers expanded consciousness itself by creating new ways to think about thinking. This cognitive recursion, the ability to examine consciousness through consciousness, proved essential for the development of both science and spirituality. Conceptual bridges to monotheism. Greek philosophical concepts, particularly those developed by Plato, Aristotle, and later the Stoics, provided crucial intellectual frameworks supporting the later development of monotheistic thought. Though not monotheists themselves, Greek philosophers created conceptual bridges that monotheistic religions would later cross. Xenophanes was one of the first to criticize gods made in our own image, pointing out that if horses had gods, they'd look like horses. He proposed a single unchanging divine principle, rather than the all-too-human deities of traditional mythology. While not yet monotheism, as it would later develop, his ideas represented early steps towards more abstract conceptions of divinity. Plato's form of the good, the highest and most perfect form, giving existence to all other forms, represented an abstract principle of ultimate perfection and reality rather than a personal deity. By describing it as beyond being, transcending even existence itself, he articulated concepts remarkably compatible with later monotheistic theological understandings of the divine. The Stoic concept of logos, the divine reason pervading and governing the universe, offered a rational understanding of divinity essential for early Christian thinkers. The logos embodied an ordered, rational principle underlying all reality, bridging Greek philosophical thought and emerging monotheistic worldviews. These philosophical concepts didn't cause monotheism, but provided sophisticated intellectual tools that helped monotheistic thinking develop and spread, particularly as these religions moved beyond their original cultural contexts. This encounter between monotheistic traditions and Greek philosophy produced a powerful synthesis that would reshape human consciousness. The legacy of Greek thought. Having established these revolutionary systems of thought, the Greeks didn't simply discard myth in favour of reason. They created something more complex. Like master chefs combining unlikely ingredients, they produced a flavour entirely new to human consciousness. Systematic thinking that could embrace both analysis and symbolism simultaneously. Rather than a clean break from the past, Greek thinkers wove the old and new into something richer. Plato himself, for all his insistence on geometric precision and logical rigour, filled his works with powerful myths and allegories. His story of describing the afterlife and reincarnation, functioned as what he called a noble lie, a symbolic narrative conveying moral truth beyond what pure logic could express. This pattern continued as Greek ideas spread across the ancient world. In Alexandria, Neoplatonist philosophers like Plotinus developed highly abstract metaphysical systems while simultaneously embracing mystical practices. They viewed logic and mysticism as complementary approaches to ultimate reality. Reason could approach the threshold of the divine, while direct experience carried one across it. The encounter between Greek philosophy and emerging monotheistic traditions created a synthesis profoundly shaping human thought. Jewish thinkers like Philo of Alexandria reinterpreted Hebrew scripture through a Platonic lens. Later, Christian theologians built systematic frameworks using Aristotelian logic, while Islamic scholars preserved and expanded Greek philosophy during Europe's Dark Ages. This merger faced challenges. Tertullian, an early Christian author, famously asked, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" questioning whether Greek philosophy belonged in Christian thought. The tension between faith and reason, revelation and analysis generated centuries of debate, occasionally erupting into conflicts, like the condemnation of 1277, when the Bishop of Paris banned certain Aristotelian teachings. Yet these conflicts reveal how thoroughly Greek categories had shaped religious thinking. The debates about God's nature, the relationship between faith and reason, and reality structure all employed terms established by Greek philosophy. Even those rejecting Greek influence responded to questions framed in Greek terms. Beyond religion, Greek systematic thought established foundations for scientific inquiry. Aristotle's emphasis on careful observation and classification, the Greek fascination with mathematical patterns, and the concept that nature operates according to discoverable principles, all eventually blossomed into the scientific revolution. When Galileo dropped balls from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, he continued a tradition of empirical testing originating with Greek natural philosophers. Greek thought didn't just change what people believed, it rewired how human minds worked. Imagine someone handing your ancestors a totally new mental toolkit: abstract thinking, systematic analysis, and deep self-reflection. Suddenly people weren't just telling different stories, they were processing reality through an entirely different system. And this mental upgrade spread like wildfire. As Greek ideas travelled through Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, they carried these thought patterns with them, shaping not just what billions believed, but how they believed it. Even people who'd never heard of Plato or Aristotle began thinking in categories these philosophers had created, like catching an intellectual accent without realising it. We may no longer sacrifice to Zeus or debate in the agora, but we still structure our world through their logic. Whether analysing political systems, debating ethics, or seeking truth itself, we continue thousands of years later using conceptual tools forged in ancient Greece. This Greek foundation provided the intellectual architecture for the monotheistic revolution that would further reshape human consciousness, uniting a radical concept of divinity from the ancient Near East with Greek philosophical frameworks to create a worldview that would dominate Western civilization for millennia. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Narrative.